So our apologies, but unfortunately our auditor, Iris, is out for some emergency medical situation. She's fine, but unfortunately she won't be able to join us today. So I'm going to do my best at pretending to be Iris for this first presentation, and then Akam will take turns pretending to be Iris with the next presentation with John from Minnesota. So please forgive us if our presentations are a little bit clunky and if we're not able to answer all of your questions today. If there is a question that you pose that we don't have an answer for, we'll certainly research it and get back to you by email so that everyone has the benefit of the answer. So as you know, today is basically a half day officially. We're going to cover this in probably less than an hour on corrective action plans and then move right into the next presentation on grantee risk assessment. Both of these sessions are related to the new guidance that our Federal Office of Management and Budget issued on the Uniform Administrative Guidance. And I know many of you had questions about this a few months ago, and there was a note on our award letters back in January saying the new Uniform Administrative Guidance will take effect immediately. We discussed that with our other offices within the agency and determined that we had some flexibility there and that it would be better to defer the requirement until fiscal year 2016. So you're certainly welcome to start implementing the rules now, but we're not expecting you to before the next fiscal year. And basically, as you probably are aware, the Uniform Administrative Guidance basically merged a lot of separate OMB circulars that had been out there for years. For the most part, it did not change what is required of you as LIHEAP grantees. So you probably hear us talk a lot about the A133 OMB circular about the requirement to have an independent audit each year if you meet the minimum threshold in federal funding. That's part of this new combined guidance and what I'll be talking about this morning. So those requirements are, for the most part, the same. It merged the guidance with some of the prior circulars on the cost principles, some of those more explicit rules about what are allowable costs and what are not. For the most part, those do not apply to you. So what we're going to talk about this morning is what is new to you through this new guidance. But we do have an information memorandum that if it doesn't go out by today, you should have by Monday at the latest, on the guidance and specifically listing which parts of the new combined circular apply to you and which don't, and reiterating when this takes effect for LIHEAP. Each program is being considered on a case-by-case basis. So FYI, if you're running other programs, the fact that we're not implementing it before 2016 may not be the same situation for your other programs. But I do believe they're applying the same rule for CSBG. So as I said, once I finish my presentation, take some questions, we'll move right into the next presentation on the Uniform Administrative Guidance, which will be Akam and John Hervanko from Minnesota. And then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back. We'll give you some general updates from our office. We'll give you a little preview of what we're going to be talking about at NUAC, for those of you sticking around for that, and answer any remaining questions and hear any comments you have for us. And then that will be the official end of our meeting. For those of you who are available and interested in sticking around a little while after that, we were thinking of having kind of an informal discussion with whoever's interested in talking about it on future training and technical assistance needs, trying to make sure that we have an accurate list of all the different needs and try to put some sense of priority on those different needs. And we'll also continue that conversation on Sunday morning for those of you who will be at the NIETA meeting. So 2 bites at that apple, and certainly we'll take your feedback after that. And then, as you know, some of our staff are here this afternoon, so if you wanted to meet with them one-on-one, you have that opportunity as well. Just a reminder, kind of a last-minute switch. Yulia is actually upstairs in room 201, so if you're with a tribe or a territory and you're interested in continuing the conversation from yesterday morning, that's where they're at, back in that same room, and they're continuing their policy development discussion. So with that, I will now put on my IRIS hat and talk about corrective action plans. So, as I was mentioning, the A133 is now part of this uniform administrative guidance. Right now, we are citing that as 45 CFR Part 75. One of the major changes is that previously this requirement for an independent audit was only triggered if the entity had at least $500,000 or more in total federal funding, not just LIHEAP funding, but any source of federal funding combined. So they've now raised that to $750,000. So that means some of our grantees, probably some of our tribal grantees and territory grantees will no longer have to do this. We certainly encourage you to think about doing an audit as a best practice, but it won't be a requirement for the federal award. So we always talk about these as the single audit. It's a rigorous organization-wide audit. They're really, as you know, we have a compliance supplement that we have to update each year, which is basically guidance to all these auditors that are hired to do these independent audits for you. And that's really their instructions for what they're supposed to be testing when they come out to your organization or to your subgrantee's organization. And so basically it will talk about any earmarking rules in terms of our caps for admin and carryover and what have you. So really you can, if you Google search compliance supplement and what we call our CFDA number, which if I get it right is 93.568, it'll pull it right up for you, and you can see exactly the guidance that the auditors are looking at when they come out to test your organization for your audit. And so they're looking at the financial records for the organization, the financial statements, the federal award transactions, the expenditures, the internal control system, the federal assistance received during the audit period. As a result, the auditor will issue a report that will identify any deficiencies, and they will be labeled either as a matter of noncompliance, which basically means one of our federal rules was not adhered to. Internal control deficiencies, this might relate to not properly separating or segregating duties, such as on the financial side, making sure that the same person who approves an expenditure isn't the one also signing and cutting off the check. So again, audit findings are usually more broad. They can be that the organization did not follow the generally accepted accounting principles or the GAAP. It could also be that the organization did not follow their own rules. So, for example, we've talked this week about how our rules don't set everything out for you. You need to have your own policies and procedures. And so if, for example, your state wasn't following your state's rules on obligation and expenditures for LIHEAP, that could be an audit finding since we don't define those terms for you. Versus it could be an actual issue of noncompliance, and again, that's where it's actually not following one of our federal rules. So, for example, if you were spending 50% of your LIHEAP award for admin costs, that would be a clear violation of one of our rules, and that would be a matter of noncompliance. So really what's new as part of this uniform administrative guidance from OMB is a requirement on all of you to now have an active role in ensuring that any sub-grantees you work with are complying with the audit requirements, that they're getting the audit, they're doing that timely, that they are responding to any noted findings or issues of noncompliance, that whatever corrective action plan they set out for themselves, they're actually trying to implement and resolving those problems. So it's really just making it clear that that's your responsibility to monitor and work with them to make sure that they're complying with that. Let me go back to that for a second. So the auditee, whatever organization is actually being audited, must make sure that they do a summary schedule, which we'll talk about in a minute, and again, a corrective action plan listing exactly what steps they're going to implement to resolve those findings. So the summary schedule is looking at any prior year findings, particularly if it's a repeat finding that's been in multiple years. Those are something that we're actually trying to track at our office, and it's one of our own performance measures. We don't ask you for the data because we can get it from other sources like the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, but just be aware that that's something we're holding ourselves accountable for, is to try to identify which grantees have repeat findings in multiple years and the extent to which you are able to actually resolve those and move forward. The summary schedule must identify the specific findings that were noted with the actual finding numbers, and then there has to be a corrective action plan for the current year findings. And going back on the summary schedule, it also has to note what action was taken to resolve them and the status, if they were actually resolved or not. For preparing the corrective action plan, we're focusing on the current findings. So not looking back at those prior years, but what's coming up in what they're seeing in this present audit. So that summary schedule, again, it must list the number attached to each finding. You'll clearly see that in the audit report. The year in which it initially occurred, again, trying to track if it's a repeat finding or not. And the status of those findings, if they've been resolved or not. It's been corrected. It's no longer a valid finding. Partially corrected, why it hasn't been corrected, fully corrected findings. Admittedly, I'm not sure what the difference is between a fully corrected finding and a corrected finding, so we'll double check on that and get back to you. But the key here is anything that has not been resolved must be noted as not being resolved, and there must be a justification for why it hasn't been resolved and what's being done at this point to get it resolved, and an estimate for when it will be resolved. The corrective action plan. So again, after the audit, this is basically part of the response from the auditee to the auditor regarding what they're going to do to resolve those findings from the current report. And really you're looking at, is the subgrantee, what they're proposing in their corrective action plan, does that seem reasonable to you that it will actually resolve the concern and resolve it effectively and timely? An effective corrective action plan will, again, note the specific finding, specifically what action will be taken, who at the entity is responsible for taking that action, and if there needs to be coordination among different partners at the subgrantee to accomplish that, and the timeline for how they're going to resolve that finding, and what the ultimate outcome is that you're going to hold them accountable for. So once they have a corrective action plan, that's not the end of the story. Then it becomes monitoring their implementation of that corrective action plan. So OMB is expecting that all of you as the prime grantees will be checking back with your sub-grantees to see the status, the progress of them actually implementing that plan. Are they meeting the milestones that they had set out for themselves? If they are off track from those milestones, what adjustments are they going to make to try to get back on track, or how is that going to affect the ultimate completion date, and is that reasonable? Doing a quality check to make sure that if they're saying the findings are corrected, that they actually are corrected. And again, for those areas where it's clearly non-compliance with a federal rule, are they now in compliance as you interpret our rules? Do they need further corrective action if you feel they are not now complying with our federal rules? And what do you recommend for that? Have they actually completed the performance of those corrective actions? And regardless of whether they've completed or not, do you feel that there's any further training that you need to do, either through your group training that you usually do annually with your subgrantees, or more one-on-one, or the guidance that you put out? Is there anything, if you're noticing a pattern, for example, among your subgrantees of findings, hopefully that will inform the training that you do and the guidance that you put out moving forward, if you're seeing some areas that are clearly confusing or just not being complied with for some reason. So again, as you know, with audit reports, in that response, you have the opportunity to clarify if you think the auditor misunderstood what it is that the organization is doing. If they misinterpreted the rules, you can provide a response. There does have to be a clear justification for why you do not agree with that finding. And all of this will be helpful to us because, as you probably are aware, audit findings typically get referred to our office through our Inspector General's office, and so then our audit resolution team works with us to determine which findings are going to need follow-up by our office, and whether that's going to trigger a disallowance or recoupment of any question costs if necessary. So having a clear response and not just simply we disagree, but a very clear justification as to why you disagree will really help us streamline that audit resolution process. And really, I will say, especially where a disallowance may be at issue, if you are providing a very clear justification up front, that will really help us in weighing whether to move forward with that disallowance, or if we want to find some room to negotiate on how much is disallowed. So here's a sample corrective action plan template, and you can see they've listed the year at issue, the specific finding number listed in the audit report, a summary heading of what the finding was, our CFDA number, which I mentioned earlier, if there were any question costs. In this case, there aren't. The status, they're saying they completed their corrective action, and then a summary of how they actually corrected that and the date by which they corrected it. And what time is it? 8:51. Any questions? So we're making up for the lost time earlier this week. Pretty straightforward, right? So really the only new part is just making it very clear that the federal government is expecting that all of you will have an active role in monitoring your subgrantees to make sure that what you're all doing for your own audits, they're doing for their audits, because again, it's a reflection on your programs and how clearly you're setting out your expectations for how they'll run the program and the extent to which you're monitoring them effectively. So if you have any questions about this, if not today, in the future, just reach out to us. Yes, Heather. Right, right.
But in that 8133 part of that, we also include our agencies if there were any findings there also. So your office is kind of taking our state plan and comparing to what they're auditing at that point? Or?
Right, great question. So Heather was asking about the state plan, and you probably recall when that GAO report came out back in 2010 on strengthening program integrity for LIHEAP, one of our first reactions was to give you a new form to complete, the program integrity assessment. which works through 13 different areas of program integrity, including your own audit resolution and the extent to which your locals are having audit findings or corrective action issues. And we, I guess it was last year when we incorporated the plan into our OLDC system, we merged the program integrity questions into the plan so that it's no longer a separate form. But we didn't actually eliminate any of those questions. So there is a section in the plan that asks about the status of your own audit findings, where you're at with resolving those, are they repeat findings, as well as the extent to which your subgrantees are having findings and you're involved in the monitoring of those. So you have an opportunity to explain that. And yes, you're absolutely right. That is something that we're looking at as we're getting audits reports referred to us to follow up on. We're checking back to see the status of all of that resolution. Any other questions? Yes?
Kind of more comment question too.
Okay.
I found that we had a situation where an agency had their single audit done and it came back with not any problems but a lot of qualifiers. But when our audit team went out, we found a lot of problems. They ended up actually shutting the agency down.
Wow.
So what happens when you don't have faith in the single audit, the local entities are commissioning themselves?
What a great question, because we've had the same reaction when we've gone out to visit. The comment, in case you weren't able to hear it, was, what if you're monitoring your subgrantees' audit reports, and for the most part they're fairly clean reports, but then when your own monitoring team goes out, you're actually finding things that the auditor is not catching. And so it kind of shakes your faith in the quality of those audits. I'm going to extend that a little bit and say we have been a little frustrated by the discretion that the independent auditors have in determining which programs are considered major programs versus non-major programs, because that will determine the level of testing the auditor does for each program for LIHEAP. And so if it's not designated as a major program, they won't actually go out and do that case file testing and really get a good determination for LIHEAP specifically. So I can tell you on some recent reviews, we actually did a coordinated visit this spring with our community services block grant team from our office. And for me personally, that was very illuminating because they definitely asked different questions, particularly of the subgrantees, than we have really been asking. And so they were going into, and of course they have a little bit of a different role with your subgrantees. As you know, through CSBG, they actually have a de-designation process, which we don't have for LIHEAP. So they go into more detail about what is the board structure looking like at that subgrantee, what's the health of that organization's leadership, if they have rules about how often the board members turn over, are those really being followed? What sort of vacancies are we looking at the board? Is half the board vacant, and has that been the situation for a while? Unfortunately, as a lot of you know, some of these organizations have really been struggling with some internal control problems, shall we say, with CFOs and CEOs having to resign or be indicted. So they've been really looking into those questions. And then some of the questions they were asking related to the audit that was being done. And they were asking, how often do you actually change the audit firm that you're using? And what they were finding is that some of these organizations were using the same audit firm for 10, 20 or more years. And so initially they may have been discovering things and reporting them, but naturally the longer you have a relationship with someone, even if it's not intentional, you just have a comfort level there and you assume, oh, they've got everything under control. And if for no other reason, it gives an appearance that it may not be the most robust audit possible. And so they've been making recommendations, and we're trying to now make recommendations to at least consider that. And for all of you, when you're out monitoring, to take a look at that. And again, you may not be able to require it, but suggest that they consider having at least a competitive process, perhaps periodically, to give an opportunity to other audit firms to have that work. And for some of the organizations that did do that after a long time with the same firm, suddenly the new audit firm would come in and there would be findings that hadn't been in the last few reports. So So not a bad practice to at least review, have we really had the same firm for a long time? Maybe it's time to just get a fresh perspective. Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
I suppose you could also just factor that into a risk assessment, that if one has had the same auditor for longer than a certain period of time, which have to be one measure of risk.
Absolutely, great point. The comment was that when you're developing your risk assessments for your subgrantees, this can be one criterion that you look at is, has it been the same audit firm for a certain length of period, or it may be, this may sound counterintuitive, but have there not been any findings in the audit reports for a certain length of time? And maybe that's worth just checking into, just to make sure it's accurate. Great point. Yes, Heather.
Something else you can require your agency to audit is you can have them do a schedule of liking only. So you can have schedules done for each separate program, not just the overall agency.
Okay.
And sometimes we request that, yes, it's an additional expenditure, and you're paying them admin, but you can actually look at all of your liking funds, and it's not listed in all the other programs. And it is part of your contractual requirement.
Great comment. So Missouri is commenting that as part of your contract or grant with your subgrantee, you can require that they have a specific schedule of findings just for LIHEAP so that it's not all mixed in with everything else, and that can really help facilitate and highlight things for you as you're doing your review. Did I get that right? Yes. Okay. Yes, David.
Actually, can I address Heather?
Yes, please.
Can you say that again?
We require in our contracts, and I can send it to you, that they prepare a separate schedule to attach to their A133 audit, where it just covers liking expenditures.
So you can tell the auditor that in addition to whatever else you're doing, we want you to focus specifically on lighting.
We can tell our agencies that we contract, in their contract, that
Oh,
our
yeah, them.
A133 audit will include a schedule specific to liking.
Got it.
Yeah, and I think the really important point here, is you can be more restrictive than the federal rules. That's a general principle. So just because we're saying, okay, you only need an audit if $750,000 of federal funding total is at issue, and it's up to the auditor to decide which is a major program, you can say, as Heather is saying, well, actually, if you're getting funding from us, and again, the communication is not to the auditor, but to the subgrantee, because the subgrantee is contracting for the audit work, we're requiring as a part of you getting this grant money that you will do an audit for LIHEAP every year. And that's part of your contractual relationship with your subgrantees. So that's perfectly acceptable. A good practice. Other comments? It's great that people are sharing what they do in their state. If you want to share anything that you do on this issue or that you think you might do on this issue. Okay.